So let's talk about the fabric choices for the lining or batting of your patchwork side panels for your pants. It is a really important selection, so we'll just go over that a little bit. So one of the products that I suggest is flannelette, or if you're in the US, I think you know it as flannel, just a lightweight cotton flannel fabric that is often used for bedding and items like that. As you can see, that is a little bit thicker. I have a little pair of scales here and I'm just going to weigh that flannelette square of 3 inches by 3 inches, and you'll see that that comes in at just over a gram. The other option that I suggested, which is some cotton lawn, which is a lot thinner and softer. And as you can see here, that weighs in at under half a gram. So the flannelette was over a gram and the lawn is coming in at under half a gram. So there's quite a big difference in the weight of those as well as in the movement of them. The goal is to achieve the same sort of weight when we combine our patchwork fabric with our lining as the weight of our main pants fabric. So for my first pair of pants with the arrow design, I used SX yarn dyed linen, which is this one here, and I can weigh that and I can see that that is around 1.1 to 1.2 grams for that fabric. Now, because I'm using quilter's cotton, I'll weigh that and that's around 0.9. So if I was to add the flannelette, I'm going to get too heavy, going up to 2 grams for that. And that is just going to outweigh the SX linen that we've used for the main pants fabric. If, however, I was to use the nice cotton lawn, as you can see here, it's coming out at around 1.3, just over 1.3 grams. So that's a lot closer to the 1.2 grams, or just under 1.2 grams of the SX linen. So they're going to work well as a pairing. So we know that our patchwork panel is not going to be too heavy compared to the main fabric, and everything will sit nicely together. Now for the cropped pair on the photo, I used a corduroy. Now this is a lot heavier than the SX linen, a lot stiffer. And as you can see here, it weighs in at around 1.8 grams for that square. I actually also used some Liberty Tana lawn for the patchwork, which is nice and thin and light. Actually doesn't have a lot of weight at all. So you'll see here when I put that together with the flannelette, it's 1.5. That's still a bit lighter than my corduroy, but much better than if I was to put it with the lawn. As you can see here, we're only getting to 0.9. So if you were to be using something heavier like corduroy or denim, then I really recommend that you use the flannelette as your lining. This is going to let you achieve that really nice quilted look a little bit more so than with the lawn, and we're going to keep those weights nice and even. Now, I don't want this tutorial to complicate this for you any more than needed, and I'm not suggesting that you go out and buy some scales and test this like I have. This was just to demonstrate what I mean when I say that we really want to achieve the same weight for our patchwork and lining fabric as we have with our main pants fabric. This will just ensure that everything sits nicely in your completed pants. So if you're using a main pants fabric that is on the lighter side of medium weight, use your cotton lawn. And if you're using a fabric that's on the heavier side of medium weight, then use your flannelette. Now this pants construction tutorial is starting at step 20, so you will have already created all of your beautiful rows of half square triangle blocks like you can see here. They're all pressed, all lovely and ready to go. As you can see, I'm working with a 2-print version, so your collection of rows may look a little bit different than mine if you're going with the 16-point version. Also here I have my pant side top lining panel. Mine is out of flannelette, yours may be out of cotton lawn, but grab that square and just place that neatly and flatly on your work surface. Now go ahead and grab your first row. This is the one that you want to be at the top of your pants, meeting your waistband, and place that on the top edge of your square. Your square will be a little bit bigger than this, and I've mentioned to pin this 1 inch down from the top edge and center it within the width. Once you're happy with it there, it's all sitting nice and flat, go ahead and pin the top edge of this row onto your lining fabric. Then go ahead and grab your second row. Now we want to make sure that we are positioning this correctly so that you get that nice alternate fabric pattern here if you're working with the 2-print version. or to maintain your nice arrow design if you're working with the 16-point version. So make sure that's all correct. Then line up your seams. Make sure everything is laying really lovely and flat together and neat. And then we can go ahead and pin them together along that edge. So we are pinning together the 3 layers, the layer of the lining, the layer of row 1, and then row 2. And what we're going to do is once we've pinned that together, you can go ahead and sew along that pinned edge. So I've just sewn that now. As you can see, we've got that lovely seam there. We are working still with a 1/4 inch seam at this stage. And what we need to do is then open that out and take that to your iron and give it a good press. And that will be your top side panel all ready to go. Now we want to start working on our pants side bottom panel in the same way. So I've gone ahead and grabbed that lining piece and popped that on my work surface, and I've just kept the top panel above it there just so I can check the configuration of the patterns. So what we want to do is we need to make sure that the top row of our bottom panel has the same pattern configuration as the bottom row on the top panel. So it's a little bit off screen here, I do apologize, but you can see how my hourglass block is the same configuration, the same fabrics in the same position as the bottom row on the top panel. This is just to allow for the overlapping section of the pocket on the side panels. So as we did for the top panel, we're now going to grab our second row that we want to be in the alternate pattern or maintaining your arrow directions. So once we have that, again, we're going to make sure that we match up all of those seams, and we're going to place those right sides together so that again we have the 3 layers of our lining, then we have row 1, and then we have right sides together, row 2. Once you're happy with how those are all positioned together, go ahead and sew along that edge. So I've gone ahead and sewn those together now, and I've also gone and pressed that. So all you need to do is open up that second row and press it in the direction that it opens up. Now we go and grab row 3, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We were positioning row 3 over the bottom edge of row 2, making sure that we maintain the direction of our design, and we get those nice and neatly together with seams matching, and then we're going to pin along that bottom edge. You can go ahead now and sew those 2 strips together. Here's my panel with that third row sewn in place and pressed open. And now we're going to continue to work on the 4th row. So what we are doing here is essentially a quilt as you go method, where we're sewing each row down and attaching it to the lining or batting layer at the same time. This just makes sure that everything's nice and even, and also that we're hiding all of those raw edges as we go. So continue on with all of your rows for the number that you require for your pants. Now we're going to move on to top stitching or quilting our side panels. So go ahead and swap out the foot on your sewing machine for your walking foot. I've gone ahead and quilted mine now and just wanted to show you the top panel. So as you can see here, I have just done some straight lines throughout the whole panel on either side of the seam allowance. So I've done that along every seam, the vertical, the horizontal and the diagonal seams, and I just think that gives a lovely result for this 2-print version. Also, once I've done the quilting, I've gone ahead and tacked down the edges of the patchwork to my lining fabric. So you can see here I've just done that with a really open zigzag stitch. You can just use a large normal stitch on your sewing machine, but just machine tack them down really close to those raw edges. This just makes sure that when we're cutting out our pattern pieces later that you're not going to have any issues with fraying or anything coming out of place when we're sewing everything together. Now we want to go ahead and cut out our template pieces from our quilted panels. So here I have the pant side top template, and I have the completed panel that we've just quilted and tacked down. And what we're going to do is we're going to pop this template on top of our panel and make sure we get it really nice and centered. Now the template is approximately 1/8 of an inch larger on each side than your completed patchwork panel will be. Now this is intentional. As we've been doing the patchwork, we've been working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but as we start constructing our pants, we're going to be using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we're just adding that little bit extra here so that we maintain the nice points on our patchwork as we sew these side panels to the rest of our pants. So what you can do is you can mark where the corners of this template is as you lay it down and you have everything centered. If you have a light box, this will make this much easier. You could trace the whole line and use your scissors to cut this out. I'm just cutting the corners or marking the corners here because I intend to use my ruler and rotary cutter to cut this out. So now that I have those little corner places marked, I can go ahead and use my rotary cutter to cut those out. As you're cutting each edge, I suggest you just double check that the measurements are correct. So for the sizes extra small up to extra large, this completed cut panel should measure 8 3/4 inches by 8 3/4 inches. And if you're making 2XL up to 6XL, this will measure 9 3/4 inches by 9 3/4 inches. So either trace the template and cut it out with scissors, or go ahead and double check this all out and cut it out with your rotary cutter and ruler. Either way, just ensure precision as you go. Now we're going to go on to do the same thing with our pant side bottom panel. So go ahead and grab that and your pant side bottom template, and now we want to line those up. Now I'm just flipping it to the other side because we need to do one direction and one the other to make sure we have 2 mirror image pieces. And we need to make sure that the top point of this template is meeting up with the top edge of your panel. So do make sure that you have this lined up on the right edge. Once it's all placed properly, you can go ahead and start to trace the template out. We can do the same as that we did for the top panel in respect to marking our corners, but for that top curved edge, we might need to make sure that we trace that nice and precisely so that that's ready to be cut out later. Now I've gone ahead and marked my corner points off camera, so I'm going to go ahead now and cut down the sides of my side panel. Like the top panel, the width of this panel will be approximately 1/8 of an inch wider than your patchwork piecing. So just keep that in mind if you are using your ruler and rotary cutter instead of using the template. So the width of this panel will be, for sizes extra small to extra large, 8 3/4 inches, or for 2XL to 6XL, 9 3/4 inches. But use your template as a guide to make sure that we're working really precisely. Once you've cut out your side edges, don't cut out your top and end. What we're first going to do is do a little stay stitch just inside our trace lines to make sure that we secure all of those seams and that nothing's going to come apart or stretch. As you can see here, I have just done a line of stitching just inside the trace line. So this line of stitching is just going to make sure that all of those patchwork seams stay together and nothing comes apart as we're working. And if you need to cut off the end as well for the length of your pants, please make sure you do the same along there before cutting anything out. Once you've completed that stay stitching, you can go ahead and grab your scissors and cut out that top curved edge. Also, if you need to shorten the end of your panel some, go ahead and cut that out now with your scissors or your rotary cutter. Once you have your first pant side bottom panel completed, go ahead and create your second one. Please make sure that you're creating this as a mirror image to your first panel to make sure that you have one for each pant side. Now we're going to fully construct our side panels. Grab your 2 pocket pieces, and as you can see, these should be mirror image of each other. And also we're going to grab our pant side top panels that are all trimmed and ready to go. Now we need to grab one of our pocket pieces and we need to place the bottom straight edge right sides together with the bottom straight edge of our pant side top panel, and make sure you double check that you are doing that to the correct bottom edge. So go ahead and line those up as you can see I am doing here. So the bottom straight edge of the pocket with the bottom straight edge of the pant side top panels. Now what we're going to go ahead and do is pin together those long edges. Now we want to sew those long edges together, but I've taken it to my sewing machine so I can show you how we now need to be looking at the markings on our stitch plate. So we're no longer working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance anymore now that we're going on to our pants construction. So find the 3/8 of an inch marking on your stitch plate, and we're going to use that now to line up the edge of our fabric as we sew. So go ahead now and sew that long edge that we've pinned together along one pocket side, and then we're going to do the same for the other pocket. If you're nervous about following the markings on your stitch plate, you can also pop something on there like a piece of sticky tape, preferably not a clear one like this one, something like a washi tape or some brown tape, and you can actually tape up along that marking on your stitch plate, so it gives you a bit of a stronger visual guide as you're going. When we sew garments, it's really important to finish off and neaten the seams after sewing them to ensure that we don't have any fraying as we wash and wear them in the future. If you don't have a serger or overlocker, this is still possible with just a domestic sewing machine. Here I am sewing a second hem together, and what I'm going to show you is how we can go about and finishing off this seam with zigzag. Some of you may have tried this in the past and found that when you took your zigzag stitches over the edge of your seam allowances, you got some rippling or some thicker bits, which won't look too pleasant when you press these and top stitch them against your garment. So in order to avoid that, this is the way that I like to do zigzag stitch. What I do is sew my line of stitching as I've done here, and then I go ahead and do a row of zigzag stitching just outside my straight stitch. So I'm not trying to go to the edge of my fabric, I'm actually doing a zigzag through the fabric just outside of my straight line. After that, you can go ahead and take your scissors and trim a little bit of the excess fabric away. Obviously you want to make sure that you're not catching any of your zigzag stitches, but you're just trimming that seam allowance a little bit to get a little bit closer to your zigzag. You could also do this with your rotary cutter in a case of a straight seam. Once you have finished your seam, go ahead and press the seam allowance to the pocket side of your seam. Now we're going to top stitch along this edge with either 1 or 2 rows of stitching close to the seam. Repeat this with your second pocket and side panel top seam. Take your completed pocket section and one of your pant side bottom pieces. Now you need to make sure that you are selecting the bottom piece that matches with your top piece. Once you've got the correct piece, what you need to do is place this panel right sides together with the bottom curved edge of the pocket. The curve should be going in the same direction if you have the correct piece. Once they're together, right sides facing, go ahead and pin that curved edge together. Next, sew the edge together with your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've gone ahead and sewn your seam, grab your scissors and trim the seam allowance to about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. This is just to make sure that we can turn out that curve nicely and neatly. We don't need to finish this edge because this edge will be fully enclosed. Once you've trimmed that away, open up the seam right sides out, pressing out the curve to neaten. Then go ahead and take that to your iron and give it all a good press. Once it's pressed, go ahead and top stitch with 2 rows of stitching close to the edge. Now we want to put the whole panel together. So grab that top stitched top pocket edge and pull it up to line it up with the second row on the pant side top panel. In the process, you're folding the pocket panel to create the inside of your pocket. Once your pocket top edge seam is meeting with the bottom of your pant side top section, meet up all of the fabrics and seams. So you really want to work towards getting it to be a seamless transition between the two pieces. Once you feel like you're happy with where it's positioned, I want you to grab a ruler and measure it to make sure that that block is now the same size as all the other finished blocks. So for size extra small to extra large, this will be a 4-inch finished block. If you are doing a 2XL to a 6XL, it will be a 4.5-inch finished block. So make sure that with the two combined together and with the seams matching, that it measures exactly what your finished block size is. Adjust it until this is really accurate. Once it's accurate, go ahead and pin these edges into place. So we're pinning from the top of the pocket edge down to the pocket bottom. Once you are completely happy with how your pockets and your edges are all positioned, go ahead and machine tack these pocket edges together just along the very edge. Once you've tacked those edges together, you have your complete pant side panel. So as you can see on the back there, you have your pocket envelope, and once you go to the front, you can pop your hand in and you now have a usable pocket. So go ahead and repeat these steps to create your mirror image second side panel piece, and then we're ready to start putting our pants together. Going to start constructing our two legs. Now I do apologise, I had a little bit of a recording error, the error being that I forgot to press record when I was sewing the pant front to my side panel. So as you can see, that has already been done, but we will go ahead now and attach the pant back to the side panel, which is done in the exact same way. So just follow this again to do the pant front. For the pant back, the long outer leg edge of the piece needs to be lined up with the edge of your side panel where the pocket sits lowest. So put those edges together, right sides facing, and then we're going to go ahead and pin those two edges together. Now the length should be the same. If there's a slight difference, do not worry, but in that case, start pinning from the top waistband edge down so that any difference in length will go to the hem end. Once you've fully pinned down the whole length of this seam, go ahead and sew that with your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you've sewn that seam, go ahead and neaten it with your overlocker or with your zigzag stitch, and then we are going to press the seam allowance towards the main pant piece. So here I have jumped back to the pant front. This is where I started filming after forgetting to film the attachment. And you'll see here how I've pressed the seam allowance to the main leg fabric. Make sure that everything's looking lovely and neat. And once you're happy with it, then you can go ahead and top stitch along that seam to the main fabric side with 1 or 2 rows of stitching. And here's the result of that, which gives a really lovely finish to your seam. Here I've sewn together both the pant front and the pant back to my side panel, and as you can see, it's looking really lovely. The back is all lovely and neat with all of the seams nicely secured, and it's all ready to be sewn fully into our pant leg. And we're going to do that by grabbing the 2 inner leg seams, and we're going to place those right sides together by folding the whole panel in half. Now on the inner legs, we will have that notch marking. So we want to pin the 2 edges together, and first what I want you to do is position those notches on top of each other. So match those up and pin that first. Then you can continue to pin down to your hem. That should be the exact perfect length. So pin that section in place first, and then go ahead to pin the remainder up to your crotch. Once it's all pinned together neatly, you can go ahead now and sew that inner leg seam. After you've sewn the seam, go ahead and neaten the seam allowance with your overlocker or zigzag stitch. Now what we're going to do is press the seam allowance towards the pants front, and then the next step we're going to do is top stitch that down. To do that, take your pant leg to your sewing machine and keep it inside out. We're going to start sewing from the crotch end of the leg. So grab that top end and place that into your sewing machine, ensuring that you're top stitching to the pant front side of your seam. Start your stitching and don't be too concerned about how you're going to get down the full length. I know at this stage it looks like it might be a little bit difficult to move all the way down your pant leg, but as you'll see here on this video, all you need to do is think about the next few inches. Make sure that the fabric is all sitting nice and flat and even for the next few inches. Sew that section and then pull down and rearrange the next section. The part that you've already sewn will start kind of curling up at the back of your sewing machine, and it will just naturally continue to curl up into that space and shouldn't become an issue whatsoever. So as you can see here, sorry if it's a little bit hard to see at certain times, but just continue with the next few inches at a time. You'll find as you get closer down to the hem end, you might need to be working in smaller little sections, but at no time should this be impossible to access. If you keep working in this way with the back bunching up behind your sewing machine and just pulling forward to expose the next little section, making sure everything's flat and even, and just continue sewing as you go. Before you know it, you will have made your way all the way down to the hem. Now continue all of these steps to create your second pant leg. Once you have both of your pant legs fully sewn together and top stitched, go ahead and grab both of them. Now we want to keep one of the legs inside out and turn the other one right sides out. Now what we're going to do is place the leg that's right side out inside the inside out leg. Put it in the same position so that we can line all of the top crotch edges up right sides together. So as you can see here, I'm lining up the inner leg crotch seam right sides together, and then we can line up the crotch front and crotch back as well. Now we're going to pin these together, so find your little notch markings. You'll find that on your crotch front you have a single marking. Place those together and then pin that in place. And then we can also do the same to the crotch back markings, which will have the double marking. Once you've pinned those together and you've pinned in the crotch seam, you can go ahead and pin all the remaining edges together, which should fit together nicely. Once that's pinned together nice and evenly, go ahead and sew this seam. When you reach the middle crotch seam, make sure you just maintain a nice smooth line. Once you've sewn this seam, go ahead and finish it to neaten, and then you will have a crotch seam that looks a little bit like what we see here. What I want you to do is we're going to press this seam. First, press it in this position that we have it in now. So just press it in its flat position. Then we want to open out the pants so that we can press the seam allowance down to one side. Once you've pressed that seam allowance down to the side, go ahead and top stitch it into this position, as you see I have done here. Now we're finally onto our waistband. So grab your two waist front pieces. Now depending on what fabric you've used, you may have one interfaced, like I have one interfaced here, or you may have both interfaced. I just recommend if you're using a heavier fabric, just do the one piece. However, if you're using something lighter like linen, go ahead and interface both pieces. And also make sure you have your waist back piece to hand. So this is a long strip, and what I ask you to do is to fold that in half along the length. So we're folding that right sides out, and then we want to give that a good press to secure that fold in place. Also make sure that you have marked all your notch markings, and also it's a good idea to mark that centermost place. That'll just make matching up your seams a little bit easier later on. So take your two front waist pieces and place these right sides together. We want to pin them together along the top curved edge. So go ahead and pin that together neatly and evenly. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and sew that top edge only using your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once that's all sewn together, go ahead and trim that seam allowance. We don't need to finish this one with zigzag or with your overlocker, as this seam will not be exposed. But just to keep that curve nice, we'll just trim down that seam allowance to between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. Once you've trimmed that, open it out, and we want to press the seam allowance towards the interface side if you only have one interface side. Otherwise, just choose a side, and we want to understitch this seam very close to the edge. If you're not sure what understitch is, it's basically top stitch, but it's done to the facing side, so it's underneath and won't be seen. I've gone ahead and done that here. It might be a little bit difficult to see on the screen, but that understitch just allows you to fold along that curved edge really nicely and evenly, and it tends to keep that top edge of your waistband crisp and in place. So fold the waistband into place and then go ahead and give that a good iron. So I've given that waist front a good press, and as you can see, it's sitting evenly and that top edge is nice and crisp. And now what we're going to do is we're going to open this out, and we're also going to take the waist back strip and we're going to open that out as well. And what we want to do is we want to position two of these ends, so one from our waist front and one from our waist back, right sides together. So we want to match up that seam in our waist front with the fold in our waist back. So line up one end and then go ahead and pin those together. And while we're at it, we may as well go and pin the other ends together as well, so that we only need to go to the sewing machine once. So go ahead and also pin the other end of your waist front to the other end of your waist back. Once those are pinned together neatly and evenly, you can go ahead and take this to your machine and sew that with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And with these seams, we do want to neaten off to finish. So now we have our complete waistband ring. As you can see here, I have finished off these seams and I have pressed them towards the waist back side. Take your length of bias binding, and what I want you to do is open out one end and fold it in by about 3/8 of an inch and give that a good pressing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bind the facing edge of our waistband strip. So the facing edge is the one that we have done the understitch on. So go ahead and grab your waistband and go to the back of your waistband, around the back middle of your waistband. And we are working on the wrong side of the waistband fabric. Get your bias binding and line this up along the raw edge. What we want to do is just pin that folded end in place so that the right hand raw edge of our bias binding is meeting up with the raw edge of our waistband ring. Take this to your sewing machine and we are now going to start sewing at that folded edge, and we're going to sew the bias binding into place on that first fold, so the first fold from the raw edge. Pull the bias binding a little bit taut as you go and continue sewing along that first fold, and we're going to continue sewing all the way around the ring. Once we get to the other end, we want to continue sewing until we have sewn a section of overlap approximately 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. So sew that overlap section and then secure your stitches. After securing your stitches, we can go in and trim the bias binding outside the stitch end. Take the two ends and open out the folds and then refold these two sections together to create the same shape as the rest of the bias binding. Once you've folded those nested in together, you can fold the bias binding over to the right side of the fabric, enclosing that raw edge of your waistband. Pin that section in place so that we keep our nice nested folds together, and then we will be ready to sew this down in place. So take it to your sewing machine again, and we're just going to pop that pinned in section under our foot and then pop down your needle to secure this in place before removing the pin. Now we're going to sew this lovely crisp folded edge of our bias binding down onto the facing side of our waistband strip. And we're sewing this into place approximately 1/8 of an inch from that nice folded edge. Take your pants and take your waistband ring. Now we're going to attach the waistband to our pants. So grab your waistband ring, and what we're going to do is we're going to put this right sides together around the top of our pants. While we're putting it on, what we want to do is match up all of the seams nicely. So the seams of our waist front will be meeting up with the seams of our pant front and side panel. So the first thing we can do is pin those seams neatly together. Next, we want to meet up the marked notchings on our waistband with the seam from the pant back and side panel. So meet those markings up with that seam and then pin those into place. And lastly, we can meet up that little center marking that we made earlier up with the back crotch seam. Pin that together, and now you can pin all the rest of the edge together between those pins. It should fit nicely and evenly. Once those layers are nicely pinned together, you can go ahead and sew your waistband into place. After sewing the waistband seam, go ahead and finish it to neaten. Now what we want to do is fold that seam allowance towards the waistband, and we're going to press it in this position. Once that's been pressed, grab your waistband, and what we're going to do now is fold it back into its waistband position. So we're folding down along that seam at the waist front and along the fold on the waist back. So now that bound edge will sit over that waistband seam and enclose it. We want to pin the section of the waistband back section only, and we need to do this from the right side of our pants. So start pinning from one end of your waist back at the waist back seam and pin all the way around the back of your pants until you get to the other waist back seam. Continue to ensure that everything is lying flatly and evenly as you go, and that that binding edge is fully enclosing your waistband seam. Do not pin down the waist front section. Now we want to sew from the right sides of the pants, and we're going to stitch in the ditch all around that pinned waist back section. I've gone ahead and done that now, and you can see that the waist front has not been sewn. If you're not familiar with stitching in the ditch, do not worry, because I will show this a lot closer up when I do the front section. But basically what it is stitching in the ditch there that's created by the seam to the pants side. So basically that line of stitching becomes invisible as it hides in the ditch of the seam. Now with sewing that line of stitches, we have created a casing for the elastic for our waist back section. Grab your pants and your elastic, and we're now going to start threading that elastic through the casing that we just created, and we're going to access that through the unsewn section at waist front. So grab a safety pin or a bodkin and attach that to one end of your elastic. Now insert the pin or bodkin into the gap at the waist front and slide it into that casing that we've created. So push it through and start guiding it through the casing, gathering the fabric as you go. Continue to gather the fabric and push it through the casing until you get to the point where only ½ inch of the elastic is still remaining out of the casing and sitting within your waist front section. Now we want to secure this end of the elastic in this position. So what we will do is stitch in the ditch of that waist front and waist back seam there, which I recommend you do from the right side of your pants. I've gone ahead and done that now and stitched in the ditch to secure that elastic. So you'll see how that line of stitching is almost invisible and we don't really see that. But if you go over it a couple of times, we've really well secured that end of the elastic in place and it won't be budging anywhere. Now what we need to do is to continue to thread the other end of our elastic that has the pin or the bodkin attached to it through to the other side of the casing. Continue to pull it through until it pokes out the other side. Once you're through to the other side, take out that safety pin or remove the bodkin and then pin the elastic in place where it's sitting. So be careful not to lose the elastic inside your casing, but you just want to pin it in place using the same pin or grabbing a pin and just secure it approximately ½ inch to 1 inch outside of that end of the casing. Now before you sew that end in place, I strongly recommend that you now try these pants on. Go and try them on or bring them to the recipient and get them to try them on and just make sure that this length of elastic is correct. You can still tighten it a little bit more by pulling out a little bit more of that elastic and trimming it off. Or if worst comes to worst and you didn't have enough elastic, there's still the opportunity to replace that now before it's fully secured. Once you're happy with the fit, go ahead and stitch in the ditch now along that other waist front, waist back seam to secure that end of the elastic. Now you can go ahead and trim away any excess. Now we need to sew together the remaining waist front edge. So start rearranging everything so it's sitting nicely and neatly and evenly. And again, we're going to pin from the front of the pants, pinning that waistband nicely into position. Now we're going to sew the remaining section of the waistband into place by stitching in the ditch, which I want to show you a little bit closer since we didn't get to demonstrate this earlier. So what we need to do is get our pants and that pinned seam, we're going to sew right in that crease there that I'm just pointing out there. So we get the pants, we pop it into our machine under our foot, and before we put our foot down, put your needle down exactly in that seam where we're wanting to sew. Now you're putting it in the pants side of that seam, not the waistband side of that seam. So just fractionally a hair's width away from the waistband into the pants. Now we're going to start our stitching right there, and we need to keep our stitching staying to the pants side of that seam, but only just to the pants side of that seam. So be careful with that. Some people may have a stitch in the ditch foot that might help you, but it is quite simple to do as long as you go nice and slowly. So we're just going to sew right at that seam until we get to the other end and then secure our stitches. Here's a little bit of a closer up look at the stitches, just so that you can get a little bit more of an idea of what I'm talking about. So you see how you can't see the stitches at all when you look at it there. But if we pull that up, you can see those stitches just slightly. They're really sitting in that ditch, so they're nicely hidden, holding that waistband in place without having an obvious stitched line. Take your last two pieces, your hem facing pieces. And what we're going to do is now sew those into a ring. So fold them in half, right sides together, so that the short ends meet. Now pin those short ends together, and now we're going to sew those with our 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn that seam, we don't need to finish it because we're actually going to open out this seam and press it in this opened out position. Once you've pressed that, we also then want to fold in one edge of the ring. Now we're folding in by about 1/2 inch. So double check that you got that about 1/2 inch. And then we want to press that fold in all the way around the ring. And here's the end results of that. So you can see how we have that nice crisp edge where we've folded in by 1/2 inch and our seam is pressed open. We're going to use these hem linings to hem our pants. So before we do that, you may want to try your pants on now to make sure that they are the correct length for you. So the pants length is going to be reduced by 3/8 an inch from what they are now. So please shorten if you need to at this stage. Once you're happy with the length, go ahead and take one of your hem facing rings and we're going to slide this over the end of your pant leg. Take that seam that we've pressed open and meet that up with the inner leg seam of your pants. Line up those raw edges and then we're going to pin them together all the way around the pant end. Once pinned, go ahead and sew the facing into place. Once you've sewn the facing into place, there's no need to finish that seam as it will be fully enclosed within the hem. So all you need to do is turn the seam right sides out. So we need to make sure that we're pulling that taut while we put that facing inside the pant leg. Get that bottom edge nice and neat and then go and press that securely. Once you're happy with how the hem has been pressed into place, you can go ahead and pin the hem into position and then we're going to sew around that hem with 2 rows of stitching. And we want those rows of stitching to be right near that facing edge. Once that's done, you'll have a beautiful hemmed edge to one of your legs. As you can see here, the double rows of stitching just give it that nice hem end, and as you can see, we have captured that nice and close to the folded edge of the hem facing. So do this again to create the hem for your second leg. A huge congratulations, you've completed your Lena pants. Now go strut your stuff and wear them with pride.